Sri Lanka's dark Christian colonial history. The Europeans were the superpowers of the world. Under the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Portuguese and Spanish divided up the newly discovered lands of the world to which their ships sailed in the act of supreme arrogance. Catholics and Protestants in Europe readily accepted that the ruler and the ruled should belong to the same faith. All three Western colonial powers, namely the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British that governed Sri Lanka, formerly known as Ceylon, in varying degrees from 1505 to 1948, had a common imperial policy, the effort to completely destroy Buddhism, by converting the Sinhala Buddhists and the Tamil Hindus into Christianity. Portugal introduced the Catholic Inquisition, which began in Spain and spread all over Europe, to the Portuguese colonies, including Sri Lanka, in its empire in Asia. As directed and sanctioned by Pope Calixtus III, Pope Nicholas V, Pope Alexander VI, and the Pope's Treaty of Tordesillas, in 1492, the duties of Spain and Portugal were to propagate the Christian faith on the rulers and people of these countries. Spain was given the western part of the world, while Portugal was given the eastern part. The popes, the crown, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British state governments gave their blessings for the use of manipulative conversion methods, example, force, fraud, allurement, and repression by overt and covert means. The Roman Catholic clergy used deceitful methods to convert followers from other faiths to the Roman Catholic Church. Sri Lanka was a victim of Western colonialism for nearly 450 years in its most brutal forms, especially during the Portuguese and British periods. The Portuguese in the Dark Age, with ruthless terror, ransacked and burnt all the Buddhist temples, Hindu kovils, and Muslim mosques in their areas of control. As a result, today, there is hardly a Buddhist temple over 150 years old in the areas controlled by the Portuguese. In close collaboration with Roman Catholic Church, the Portuguese conquistadors set in motion a ruthless policy of destroying the Buddhist monasteries and using the materials collected from the destroyed Buddhist temples to build their churches on the same sites which once had the Buddhist temples. For example, the Roman Catholic churches at Kalutara, Totigamua, Keragala, Watala, etc., were built on the sites of Buddhist temples. The Portuguese, led by the Captain General of Colombo, Diogo de Melo, attacked and demolished the Colonial temple, which was of incalculable value to the Buddhists. This happened in 1575. The villagers who resisted were either killed or thrown to the Colani River and drowned. The Portuguese built the Church of Saint Anne at the site of the destroyed Buddhist temple. According to oral traditions, upon entering any village, the Portuguese would systematically destroy any Buddhist temple, and then erect a Christian shrine in the village, some of which were to develop later into big churches. The Portuguese put to the sword all those who resisted the destruction of the temples. While pursuing a policy of destruction and plunder of Buddhist temples, the Portuguese held various inducements for Buddhists to convert to Christianity. Conversion meant a sure means of exemption from taxes due to the government granted only to Christians. Empowered by the blessings of the popes and the Portuguese crown for the wonders of Christianity, the Portuguese invaders exploited the conquered territories to the maximum by stripping the country's resources, labor, and the treasures of the royal houses of Kotte, Sitavaka, and Kandy. Parallel to this policy was their unrelenting engagement in destroying the cultural and religious heritage of the Sinhalese and the Tamils. Sri Lanka suffered and declined. However, the Western colonial powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, were unjustly enriched and profited substantially from their captured colonies. The Portuguese were motivated by two main factors in the 16th century. The desire to colonize Asian countries for trade and exploitation of natural resources, and the desire to convert the inhabitants of these lands to Christianity through Roman Catholic missionary activities to suppress all other religions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. There is no page in the story of European colonization more gloomy and repulsive than the proceedings of the Portuguese in Sri Lanka and Goa. The Portuguese attempted to convert the country's people to Christianity. They ensured the suppression of Buddhism with rapacity, bigotry, cruelty, and inhumanity unparalleled in the annals of any other European colonial powers. Inhuman barbarities were accompanied, which knew no distinction between man, woman, and child, no feeling of compassion to terrify their subjects. The Portuguese committed atrocities which included babies being spitted on the soldiers' pikes, parents smashed to the pulp between millstones, and mothers compelled to witness the pitiful sight of their babies being tortured to death before their two being put to death. Men were thrown over bridges for the amusement of the troops to feed the crocodiles in the rivers. The Sinhalese invited the Dutch to help fight the Portuguese. So, the Dutch expelled the Portuguese in 1658 and ruled till 1796, lasting 150 years. The ardently Calvinist Dutch Protestants in the early years curtailed the missionary activities of the Roman Catholic clergy but spread their Reformed Church activities in Sri Lanka. In their evangelical activities, the Protestant clergy were better organized than their Catholic counterparts and used schools to propagate their faith. Dutch colonials were historically notorious for racism and slavery and concubine mindsets with native women. They would use their native wives against native men. Dutch colonial rulers used the common method to humiliate native Sri Lankan men and spread propaganda against them. In addition, they pitted Sinhalese against each other, up-country versus low-country. Dutch rule in Sri Lanka was brief, but racist towards Sri Lankan people and humiliating to Buddhism. The British ousted the Dutch from Lanka in 1796 and found the existence of a small independent kingdom in Kandy not acceptable. Not long after they arrived, the British established contact with the king and contracted to replace the Dutch as protectors of the kingdom. The first major British invasion of Kandy, in 1803, failed and suffered the same fate as those of the Portuguese and the Dutch. Eventually, the British succeeded in taking over the kingdom in 1815. Despite the British agreement with the Kandian Convention, the British quickly began to disregard the convention and agreement, which irked the leaders and the people even more when they constructed a church within the sacred precinct of the Temple of the Tooth Relic in Kandy. The ban on proselytizing and mission schools were also disregarded by the British. Within 50 years, the British breached their solemn guarantees and commitments to the Kandian Convention and Buddhism. This led to a popular rebellion against British control in 1818. During the uprising, thousands were slaughtered by the British forces with unprecedented ferocity and brutality, employing all the power and technology at their disposal, burning, including rice crops, pillaging, destroying houses, fruit trees, and domestic animals, devastating villages, hanging, killing, and raping. They decimated the countryside. After it was suppressed, the Kandian provinces were integrated with the rest of the country. Earlier, for over 2 centuries, the Kandians in Sri Lanka valiantly withstood the efforts of 2 contemporary world powers to conquer it and paid a massive price in terms of men, resources, and social coherence. So, by the early 19th century, the weak kingdom was conquered by a strong empire. Restrictions on European land ownership were lifted, and Christian missionary activities became intensive, again. Invading British forces destroyed many Kandian villages and Buddhist temples. The peasantry suffered immensely as the British authorities did not recognize the local land title forms. Their lands were occupied and cleared by British planters to plant coffee, a crop already flourishing in the highlands. In parallel, thousands of elephants were slaughtered to make the newly cleared highlands safe for the planters. By the end of the 19th century, a nationalist sentiment had permeated Sri Lanka society's social, religious, and educational fronts. Meanwhile, Revivalist movements in Buddhism sought to modernize their institutions and defend themselves against Christian inroads by establishing schools to impart Western education unmixed with Christianity. This agitated atmosphere set the stage for social and political changes in the first half of the 20th century. For a nation that had remained unbowed for over 2,300 years. And the heroic struggles our ancestors waged 200 years ago against the mightiest empire that the world had known up to that time. Britain, after 133 years of cruel devious strategies and controls of Sri Lanka, left following the Second World War. Sri Lanka has a tenable claim for a public apology, reparations and compensation from the Western colonial powers, particularly Portugal and Britain, for crimes against humanity such as mass murder, war crimes, religious and ethnic cleansing, the theft of cultural artifacts, forcible conversions, large-scale destruction and plunder of Buddhist temples and seats of higher learning in the country. In respect to the acts of violence and destruction perpetrated by the Portuguese and British colonial rulers, most definitely constitutes crimes in international law today. So, the question arises, whether Sri Lanka as a victim of Western colonial expansion has the right to claim compensation from the Western colonial powers. These crimes included destruction of lives, mass murder, cultural genocide, religious, ethnic cleansing and removal of national treasures to Portugal, Holland, England and the construction of churches on sites of destroyed Buddhist temples. Plus, religious conversion by the use of force, inducements to embrace Christianity and channeling revenues due to Buddhist temples to Christian churches and seminaries. Britain repeated these shameful colonial performances many times in other parts of the world, and ironically the British now preach human rights to the world. Today, surprisingly, some of these same Western countries are championing human rights and lecturing on religious liberties to the descendants of the persecuted victims whom they had systematically violated in non-Christian societies in the past. Recently, Pope John Paul sought forgiveness from Israel, China, the natives of the Americas, Greece and the indigenous people in Canada for all the wrongful and sinful actions perpetrated by the Roman Catholics throughout the ages. So, why is the Pope yet to tender an apology directly and specifically to Buddhists for all the atrocities committed by Christian missionaries in Sri Lanka as directed and sanctioned by the popes in the colonial past? Miraculously, Sri Lanka did not become another Philippines. The indigenous people of the Philippines had been stripped of their traditions, religion and culture and made to accept their country renamed after the colonial Spanish king, Philip. Today, these past colonial powers choose to ignore their own atrocious war crimes and point fingers at Sri Lanka. So, the threat to Sri Lanka's sovereignty and the preeminent position of Buddhism is real, even today. Our ancestors survived against the fiercest colonial rulers. Will we be able to survive the modern-day colonials in disguises?